Welcome, Chargeback Army, to another episode of Chargeback Forward. And today, we're going to talk about one of the best beat-em-ups ever made.
The glorious Streets of Rage.
Oh, fantastic. Now, check out our other channel for a review on the actual LP that we're going to be talking about here. But today, we're going to be talking about the game and how it was a bit of a screw you to Nintendo from Sega.
And in an era where that animosity between competitors was palpable.
Absolutely.
And especially in retrospect, looking back, a quick unsolicited plug. Console Wars by this guy here is a phenomenal retelling of the 16-bit wars, and the fact that it was the Wild West, and it was the calling of the golden age of video games, as far as I'm concerned.
It really was. To me, the 16-bit generation has always been the renaissance of video games. And the thing about Streets of Rage, it was kind of an answer, basically. So Final Fight, there were beat-em-ups before Final Fight. Everyone remembers Double Dragon and several others. But Final Fight was the one that really was successful. And at the time, Nintendo got the rights from Capcom to release it on, it was going to be a launch title, essentially on Super Nintendo. So Sega needed an answer for that. And they created Streets of Rage. Now, what was crazy was the arcade version of Final Fight was 2-player. But the Super Nintendo version was 1-player. They removed a character.
So you're down from 3 characters in the arcade, down to 2 in the game.
And they removed a complete stage, and it was only 1-player, not 2-player, which is crazy for a beat-em-up to think about it now.
So, of course, this was because they wanted it to be a launch title.
Yeah.
And they were able to make it, but as we know from today, where companies will release unfinished messes and then have day 1 patches and patches throughout time. When you released a game, it was permanent, and so making the decision to nix a level, nix a character, and make it 1-player was a trifecta that essentially hobbled the experience. Mm-hmm. And so this is where Streets of Rage comes into play.
So here we have now, arguably, maybe not as good looking in terms of sprite work. Like, Final Fight did have the advantage of having larger sprites and very beautiful backgrounds. Streets of Rage had smaller sprites. Now the backgrounds everything was excellent. But here's a game that suddenly, there's 3 characters to choose from. It's 2-player simultaneous. It's got this thumping, beautiful soundtrack.
Again, check out our check out our soundtrack review, link below.
And everything moves very quickly on the screen too. It's taking advantage of the Genesis's faster processor, which is like the one technical advantage it had over the Super Nintendo. Mm-hmm. But man, I think it caught people off by surprise. To be honest with you, I don't think people were really expecting it to be that good.
I think this is also the reason why the Super Nintendo, despite some of the momentum it would have had at launch, you have to remember, back when the Super Nintendo came out in 1991, the video game world didn't operate the same. It was still very much a child's toy. Mm-hmm. That's how adults in the late 80s viewed it. And so getting into the early 90s, and you have your child, if you're a parent, and they have a Nintendo Entertainment System, and they have X amount of games, the concept of buying a new system that they'll have to buy new games for and is incompatible with the old games was a bit of a sore spot. And then when you have a bit of, some titles were rushed. Obviously, Super Mario World was released and it was a flawless, beautiful experience. But not every game at launch, and this is for every console, every generation, launch is not the best time. You know, it's the time for Flash, and Final Fight was Flash, but it was an empty Flash. And especially even more empty because this was released, Streets of Rage was released in August of 1991, before the North American launch of the Super Nintendo. Yes. And you have 3 characters, 2 players, rocking soundtrack, 8 or 9 stages. It was a very complete, engrossing, replayable game. And so when you have that on an established system like the Sega Genesis, where the Super Nintendo was supposed to absolutely trounce it, it didn't have that effect. You had the negativity of the concept of a console upgrade for those that weren't really aware of that at the time. You also have the fact that the competing system has a slightly less attractive game, but it plays the way that you want that big exclusive Final Fight to play on the Super Nintendo. And even though even though, like, to be honest with you, when I think of the soundtrack for Final Fight, I immediately think of the soundtrack for Final Fight CD on Sega CD. I don't like right now, and then Mike, you and I are very good with our musical memory, and it's right now I'm drawing a blank as to what Final Fight sounded like on Super Nintendo, and who knows, I may have never played it because I had this game, and by the time I was ready to consider Final Fight, it showed up on the Sega CD with a CD quality soundtrack. Re-recorded, rearranged, expanded upon. So the Super Nintendo release was redundant. And I do believe Streets of Rage played a huge role in that game not having the impact in which I believe Nintendo and Capcom thought it was going to have.
Yeah, absolutely, and it made them answer back with Final Fight 2, which they had to go back to the drawing board, and Final Fight 2 was more of a Streets of Rage style game where they used smaller sprites, faster gameplay. They, I don't think anyone will ever admit to it back then, but I think they looked at Streets of Rage 2 and said, let's borrow a few ideas here as well.
Of course.
Yeah.
Another thing as well, you have a complete experience in this game, and Nintendo and Capcom, I can't confirm who made this decision, but there was another edition of Final Fight that was released on the Super Nintendo, and that was Final Fight Guy, where I believe they took out Cody.
Took out Cody, yeah.
So the dude with the blonde hair, the blue jeans, and the white shirt, kind of looking similar to this guy right here, and replaced him with Guy. So you still had an incomplete experience. And Mike, you are the man when it comes to video game trivia. Was Final Fight Guy a 2-player game, and did it have the missing stage?
No and no.
So there you go. Streets of Rage came around at a very crucial time. I believe 1991 was the coming out year for the Sega Genesis. That's where they kind of said, you know what? We've been around for 2 years, but now we have the big guns. We're focusing more than just on arcade ports and celebrity endorsements.
That's an excellent point, because I think a lot of people don't know, who weren't around at the time like we were, at least at the age, know that the Sega Genesis wasn't like this huge success right away. It kind of floundered in North America and Japan for its first couple of years. It really, Terence is absolutely correct. It wasn't until 1991 where you had Sonic the Hedgehog and things started turning people's heads. And then when this game came out, again, a few months before the Super Nintendo launch, I remember very clearly going to my local video game store. We had these kiosks set up where you could, play a game for a bit, and they popped that in for me because I was all waiting for Final Fight for Super Nintendo, and I played this, and I was kind of like, holy crap! Like, where did this come from? I knew that I was still paying attention to import stuff at the time, and I kind of maybe seen some screenshots of Bare Knuckle, as this game's called in Japan, and didn't think too much of it until I physically played it. And it changed a lot of my mind about how Sega was now handling their console.
And that is a absolutely amazing point. Think about this. Up until that point, a lot of thunder from the Sega Genesis, and quite frankly the video game industry as a whole, was arcade ports. Back in the 80s and into the early 90s, into the mid-90s really, video games, the pinnacle, the Valhalla, if you will, were the arcades. That's where the games looked the best. That's where, it was the most authentic experience. And any home console conversion was an approximation. Whether it was a decent approximation at the time, for example, Double Dragon on the Sega Master System was a surprisingly competent port, despite the fact that the graphics were more on par with the Japanese series that wasn't called Double Dragon. The creator essentially said, hey, I want to make a game about my turbulent years in school and all the fights I went through, and that was that game, but then it was made into Double Dragon for our audiences. So it looked more similar to those graphics, but it was, other than that, it was arcade. It was a faithful interpretation of the arcade experience. On the Nintendo Entertainment System, we saw the other end of it, where it's like, hey, this great arcade game, but it was a completely different experience. It had RPG elements, the stages were different, it was single player, it was a very different breed. Now with Streets of Rage, this represents a deviation from what was traditionally regarded as successful in video games. It's like, oh, let's get Altered Beast home and have that as our first pack-in game. Golden Axe, Ghouls and Ghosts, the list goes on and on. But with Streets of Rage was positioned to be a direct competitor to Final Fight but Streets of Rage never saw the light of an arcade.
That's true. It was its own thing, which was,
yeah,
again, another turning point for Sega. You're right, where they concentrated so much on these arcade games. And Final Fight was an arcade game, and that's, I think, is what made Sega really Sega at the time. It really differentiated themselves to say, you know what, arcade games are great. They paid the bills for a while, but it's pretty obvious from what our competitors are doing. People want something else. So let's do that, and let's try to do it better. And they did it with Streets of Rage.
Now, having them make this specifically for the Mega Drive, like Sega Genesis hardware, versus porting it from the arcade, which ran on System 16. The Genesis hardware was based off of System 16, but make no mistake, it was not an equal to System 16, and there were always concessions made.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was just graphically, other times it was the reformatting of a game. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker comes to mind as an obvious example. This was an isometric 3/4 overhead action game, but yet when it came home, we had what we are very familiar with, the side-scrolling adventure. Streets of Rage was built from the ground up for the Mega Drive and the Genesis. Streets of Rage was Sega saying, hey, this is a really popular genre, and we need to put our unique stamp on it. And unique stamp they did, with great at the time graphics, even though inferior to Final Fight. They realized very well what they were trying to accomplish by my estimation. Also, the music was top notch. The gameplay was very precise and very rewarding, and the new things they were able to do, like team attacks, or if you're grabbed by an opponent and as opposed to just accepting, cheap hits, you're able to kick them back. It was much more. It's weird to use the term, but in the world of 1991, it was much more interactive, and that is the game that we talk about. There were two official sequels to it. There was many misfires on trying to revive the franchise, and that's fine. I would prefer, honestly, this to remain as a 16-bit classic.
I think at this time that's pretty reasonable.
Because we're not gonna. I don't think you can recreate the magic when it comes to the music and just how new, even though it was an established genre at the time, because we had this type of game since Double Dragon is the game that wasn't the first game, but it was the game that really exposed the video game world to the beat 'em up, to the classically defined beat 'em up. But this is a game that is a pinnacle of that. Yes, many people will say Streets of Rage 2 is a better game, and I'm not going to discount that. Everybody has their personal preferences. I'm not trying to be an elitist here, but this is the game that really drew me. This is the game I got it when it came out. And not unlike John Wick versus John Wick Chapter 2. John Wick, the movie, starring Keanu Reeves, came out of nowhere, essentially. And because it came out of nowhere, it surprised us, and it delighted us on something that Hollywood refuses to give to people that are willing to give them money anymore. John Wick Chapter 2, though it was still a very good movie, it no longer had that element of surprise. And I find a direct correlation between John Wick 1 to Streets of Rage 1, and then John Wick Chapter 2 to Streets of Rage 2.
Yeah, I think the original Streets of Rage will always have a special place, especially in our hearts. It might be different for people who are looking back or hadn't played them in order when they came out. Maybe someone's first experience is with Streets of Rage 2, and when they go back to Part 1, they think, well, Streets of Rage 2 is 20 times better.
Yes.
But, it's one of those things, like, I think where Terence and I have the advantage over a lot of other people, being the fact that we were not only alive when this game came out, but old enough to appreciate and understand what was going on. And I think that's really the advantage we have over most people right now, is like people. It's easy for people to go back and look at a retro game and say this, whereas we lived it in real time. We experienced it in real time, and now we can look back and we can maybe give people a bit more of a time capsule of what actually life was like, or what it was like walking into a store and seeing this for the very first time in the fall of 1991. And
that plays so well into what Chargeback Forward has evolved into in our latest iteration, the rebirth, if you will. The rebirth in where we understand that our lives are busy and we have a lot to do and we have a lot of responsibilities. Our time is limited, and we really need to focus that time on things that benefit us. So the focus that we have at Chargeback Forward now, for you, the Chargeback Army, is we're really only going to focus on the games that we feel are worth revisiting if you've played them before, or giving a chance if you've never played before, where you look beyond flashy graphics and it has to be on the newest system. This game, what are we looking now? 27 years old, we're still talking about this game. We still enjoy this game.
And the good news is now, if you want to go back and play it today, there's several different ways to play it. It's
yeah.
on pretty much every Genesis compilation out there. Obviously, you can still get it on the Genesis itself.
Yeah, you can
CD.
You can get it independently, I believe, on the PlayStation Store, the Xbox Store, whatever they call it now. I wanted to call it Xbox Live Arcade, but that's showing how much I pay attention to Xbox these days. But it's a game that you can virtually get anywhere. It's a very inexpensive. It is a phenomenal game. A game that Mike and I almost called you Big Mike, and I always want to call you Big Mike, but a game that Mike and I both agree on, that we recommend to you. This is part of Chargeback Forward's curated collection of video games that are worthy of your time.
That's pretty good so far.
That's pretty good.
Snatcher and Streets of Rage is a great start.
It's a great
to
start.
come back to. Thank you, everyone.
And we'll keep it going. Thank you again for all of our friends that have supported us throughout the years. Thank you for the thousands of you that have not canceled your subscription in our 4-year hiatus. So there's that. Also, please check out our brother channel, Video Game Soundtrack Review, where you can hear us talking about the LP soundtrack version of Streets of Rage. And also there will also be a link where you can get a little peek at how we listen to it, so you can share the experience. So I would love to open up our home, or my home. This is my pad here. I would love to open it up, just like Big Mike opens up his home to friends. But if we had everybody coming over to be like, hey, come listen to vinyl, this couch would be ruined in a day, and there'd be thousands of people through here. So we wanted to give you a little taste of how we experienced it. So again, our videos will be coming to you. There is no set time. We're done with the days of new episode every Wednesday at 6 p.m. or whatever it was. So be sure to like the video. I'm doing that thing again.
Subscribe.
So you gotta like, subscribe,
hit the bell,
and smash that bell. Smash that bell like Axel was smashing this thug right here. You're gonna bring an Uzi pistol to a fist fight. You're gonna get a foot in the face. That right there, that dude's face is the bell that we want you to smash, because we want you to know when we come up with new videos. And that's all we have for today. So remember, guys, put down the controller and pick up something else. Video games are great to play, but they are a piece of our lives. They are not all of our lives, and we enjoy games so much more when we take them in context and we have breathing room around them. And one of those games is Streets of Rage, a game that we like to smash and then breathe after and get on with our lives.